This lesson is titled Managing vSphere Hosts with PowerCLI. It's part of the VMware vSphere PowerCLI training course. In this lesson, we're going to be working with the VM host commandlets. I'm going to talk a bit about what that means. I'm going to talk about the get VM host commandlet, which is the most important, and it's a really key for working with any of your host servers. Then I've got lots of demonstrations and examples to go through in several different categories. The first of those is how to add an ESX server to vCenter. We're going to talk about working with host accounts, how to work with host services, how to configure network time protocol, how to configure simple network management protocol, different ways to maintain your ESX hosts, and then working with host profiles. Okay, now let's get into an overview of the VM host commandlets. VM host is the PowerCLI term for ESX server. Now, I say that it's the PowerCLI term because a lot of the PowerShell commandlets that are used for working with ESX hosts, they literally have the word VM host in the name. You can see on the right here, I've got a screenshot where I used PowerShell to kind of group a lot of the commandlets together that have the word VM host in them. And there's over 60 of them. As you can see here, we have some ranging from VM host to VM host NTP server, all the way down to the bottom here, VM host profile compliance. All these have something to do with working with resources available to a host server. There's a full range of features for maintaining your hypervisor, everything from working with the user accounts, which they're called host accounts, to the disks, the firewalls, storage subsystem, networking subsystem, updates, patches, SNMP. There's a lot of stuff to go over. We're going to be giving you examples of many of them during this lesson. Now, the most important commandlet is get VM host. Like anything in PowerShell, once you've learned the verbs, you really got half of your work done. Get stands for retrieve an object. VM host is a host server. We talked about that. So the get VM host commandlet displays information about some or all of your ESX servers. Now it returns a VM host object, not static text. So this is an important distinction about pretty much everything with PowerShell. When you type get, you're returning an object. There are no required parameters for this commandlet, but it does have some parameters. Optional ones include data store, distributed switch, location, resource pool, state, and VM. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of these here. These are all, you could call them filters. So if you type get VM host, and I'll show you some examples here shortly. If you type it by itself, you'll return all the ESX servers to which you are connected. If you include some of these parameters, then you can filter it to show only those that meet that criteria. So if you have a data store that you wanted to see which ESX servers are connected to that data store, you could do that. If you want to see which ESX servers are connected to a certain DV switch, you could do that. If you want to see which ones are located within a cluster or a folder, you could do that, or a data center, you could do that with the location parameter. A resource pool, then you could use that to see which ESX hosts are, have a certain resource pool. State, actually we'll talk about that later. And then VM, you could say which VM host is actually providing, hypervisor services for a given virtual machine. Now each of these actually will accept multiple values. So if you wanted to say which VM hosts are connected to my LUN 1 and LUN 10 of my, my data stores, well then you could do that. Now I've got a gotcha here I wanted you to remember. In PowerShell, it's often advisable to store the results of a commandlet or a function or anything in a variable for use with working with that later. For example, if you type get VM, you might want to return the results of that and put that in a VM variable. Well, you can't use $host in the same way because that's a reserved variable name in PowerShell. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Now let's go into the Power CLI console and mess around a little bit with VM hosts. Okay, as you see here, I've got a Power CLI console window open. I'm going to go ahead and connect to my vCenter server. Okay, now $VC just contains literally the IP address, or you could use a name for my vCenter server. Now, since I am logged on with credentials which match credentials on my vCenter server with user count, permissions to get to vCenter, I didn't have to provide any sort of username at all. But that's one of my favorite features is the pass-through authentication. So we're going to be working with VM hosts. So first of all, let's look at the VM host commandlet. If I just type help space get-vm host, you'll see a synopsis here. Retrieves the host on a vSphere server. And you can see different signatures here showing you some of the different parameters available and how you can use them. I find that this particular display is not extremely helpful. It takes a minute of observation to figure out what it is they're trying to relay. So I've got a different way that I like to display this information, which I'll show you in a minute. Now, I'm not going to read through the description right now, but I just wanted to show you that. And don't forget help, it's very important. So I have this script called GPM. So what it returns is multiple parameter sets. You can see here that we've got 1, 2, 3 of them. Default set, secondary parameter set, and distributed switch. You can think of a parameter set in PowerShell similar to a mode. So we could say that it wouldn't be inaccurate to say that this commandlet has 3 different modes. And sometimes it's not extremely clear as to what the differences are, but because it's not necessarily focused in the help documentation. But this one is actually kind of obvious here at the bottom, distributed switch. So when you're in distributed switch mode, then you'll be working with the relationships between VM hosts and distributed switch. So the way that different modes are selected depends on which parameters you use. So if you look at the top here, the default set, we have data store, state, location, name, so on. And this next one has VM, but the default set parameter set doesn't have a VM parameter. You scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that we've got a distributed switch parameter here, and it doesn't exist in the other one. So that's how these are triggered. And I've got a couple of columns here I'll explain. Is mandatory and pipeline. So generally speaking, there is exception. Generally speaking, if you see is mandatory set to true, that means that you must supply a certain parameter. Otherwise, PowerShell will give you an error or it might prompt you for a value. And pipeline is whether or not the value for a given parameter is accepted over the pipeline. So what this means, since this says distributed switch pipeline true, that means that I can return, well, here, let me show you. Oh, first, let me talk about the type column. You can see, let's look at VM, for example. VM accepts values of a type virtual machine, so it accepts virtual machine objects. Remember, PowerShell is all about working with objects. Let's type get VM, get a list of those real quick, DB. So we see I've got one here called DB, get VM, DB, pipe that to get VM host. Okay, so what this did, let me scroll up a little bit. See, we have a parameter set. VM is the name of our parameter, and it's accepted over the pipeline. So because I knew that it was accepted over the pipeline, I could do this. I could type get VMDB and pipe it to get VM host. I've got that filter so that it's only showing the VM hosts, which are, in this case, providing the hypervisor services for this one VM. So that's just one example. Let's look a little bit at the output displayed here. I'm going to type get VM host by itself. As I mentioned, there are no required parameters, so it's just going to display some default information. Let's look at these properties here, and that's what these are called, these columns. Each one of them are a property. Name is pretty straightforward. Now, since when I built my lab out, I didn't have DNS set up properly, so it was easier for me to just name my VM hosts by their IP addresses. So that's what you see here. If you use proper names, then you'll see the names of your VM hosts. Connection state, this one is kind of obvious. These are connected. Now, if you've got a host that's in maintenance mode, then it will show that here. If it's disconnected, not on the network, whatever, you'll see that here as well. Power state, of course, that's whether your box is on or off. ID, you see this these three dots, that's basically indicating that the values are too long to fit and it's sort of truncated them. ID field, you're not going to use that one too much, so I'm just going to kind of skip over it, but it's basically the internal identification inside of the vCenter database. CPU usage megahertz, that's showing how much CPU is being utilized on these two VM host servers. CPU total, so you can show how much CPU you've got available. And then memory usage megabyte and memory total megabyte accordingly. So obviously you can see at a glance some nice little information about your VM host servers. Now let's examine these a little more. There's actually more in here. So what I'm going to do is, now remember I told you it's nice to assign things to variables and you can work with them easier. And I told you that this wouldn't work because why? Because $host is a reserved variable in PowerShell. So let's not use $host. Let's just say VM host. Okay, so what I've done is I've taken the two VM host objects, which are these two VM hosts right here, and I've assigned them to this variable called VM host. In fact, if I just type VM host, hit enter, you can see it's the exact same output. Now, the reason I did that is I wanted to inspect them a little more. So I will pipe them to format list, which is a PowerShell commandlet which will come in handy. This is taking a little bit longer because in the background, PowerCLI is requesting a little more information about these objects as you go through. Now it just spit out information about my first VM host, and it's going to, in a moment, spit out the second one. There it goes. Okay, let me scroll up to the top of this output. Okay, don't pay any attention to the yellow warning that VMware will actually get rid of at some point. I don't think it's that useful. State, connection state, these are actually both the same thing. We talked about them. Power state, we talked about that one. Let's see, VM swap file data store ID. If you have your host servers configured to store the swap files in a different data store than your virtual machines, then you would see information about that here. There's a VM swap file policy that's related to the above. Parent ID, this is related to, in this case, it's the ID number of the cluster to which these hosts are a member. Is standalone false or true? That's basically, I believe, whether it's managed by a vCenter or not. And manufacturer and model. Now, of course, as I talked about in the way my lab's built, these are virtualized ESX servers. If you've got real hardware here, you're going to see, your HP, your Dell, your IBM, and maybe it's an HP DL360, G6 or G7, that type of information can be right here. So that's pretty handy. Num CPU, obviously I've just got one for mine because of virtual, but you're going to have 2, 4, 6, 8, 12, whatever for yours. Processor type, a lot of interesting information in here, especially version and build information. You can see right here. Parent, now this is actually the name of the cluster to which my hosts are a member. And there's some other good information in here about the network. Let's see here. Here's the name. Now each of these, the bit on the left of the colon, that's the property name, and the bit on the right is the value. And now you can see there's a blank line. So now it's repeating this list of information, but this time it's for my second VM host. So now you know what kind of information is available to you at a glance for working with VM hosts. Now we're going to talk about how to add an ESX server to vCenter. Obviously, this is going to be one of the first things that you do once you've got a new vSphere server set up. Here's a screenshot of how you can add an ESX server to vCenter. You've probably done this before using the Add Host wizard. You just supply a host name, username, password, that sort of thing, and hit next, and it's really not a whole lot to it. To do this in PowerCLI, you're going to use the add VM host commandlet. I'm going to browse through the help file for that and show you some parameters and show you how to work with it here in a moment. First, let's talk a little bit about the commandlet. As I said, this commandlet is used to add ESX servers to your vCenter environment. It's called add VM host. The name makes a lot of sense. It has some required parameters. First one being the name. That's going to be the host name of your vCenter server. And this is going to reflect what you see, what the name is as you want it to appear in vCenter. Another required parameter is location, and this is going to be usually a data center or a cluster. If you don't have any clusters set up, then you can use specified data center, and I'll show you how to specify that here in a moment. And then credentials. Obviously, you're going to need to put down your root ID, or if you've created another user ID for joining and managing your ESX server, you can provide that. Has some optional parameters such as port, force, and run async. Port, I don't think most shops are going to be using that one, but you can if you had some reason for changing some of the default ports that are used to manage ESX server. You could do that. Force, this is to override. There is a warning that appears if you don't have real SSL certificates on your hosts. Then you're going to get a warning that it's not a trusted certificate. If you use force, then you won't even get the warning. It'll just go ahead and proceed. Run async, this is a parameter that you will see on a lot of different PowerCLI commandlets. And it stands for run asynchronously, and it means that you're going to start an operation and then pretty much immediately get returned back to your script or your prompt in PowerShell, and then vCenter is going to take care of the rest. So if you've added many hosts to vCenter, you know that process can take a minute or two, and if you use run async, then you don't have to wait a minute or two to get control back. There's a couple of related commandlets like move VM host and remove VM host. We're not going to talk about those in great detail, but obviously if you add, you can remove. I will say there's some caveats to removing, and it's nothing special that you haven't seen in vCenter, the client. If you've messed around enough, you can't delete a host server if it's in use. So there's plenty of things that could stop you from being able to remove a VM host using this commandlet. So basically, you don't get any shortcuts. As I said earlier in this lesson, the PowerCLI uses the same application interface as a vCenter client, so it's really doing a lot of the same actions. Move VM host. This is if you want to move a VM host between folders or clusters. You can do that using that commandlet. Okay, here we go. Let's check out add VM host. Okay, you can see there's a small set of parameters here at the top. I'm going to show you my usual. Okay, now you can specify a name as a string, port as an integer, a location as a VI container, and that basically just means one of several types of containers like folders or data centers that can hold other items. Credential, username, password, force, and run async. So let me show you how this would work out. Usually, if I type get data center, you can see that I've got one. It's called basement. Well, let's bring up the vCenter console. So here is what my virtual center looks like. I've got one data center and one cluster and two VM hosts inside of that cluster. If I wanted to, for example, add a new VM host to the basement data center, I could do it like this. Let's say DC equals get data center, and then I would add VM host name, and then let's call it the new VM host, whatever, and then user root password And then location, what I would do is actually provide DC. And that's basically it. I'll say run async. Now this is actually not going to work because I don't have an ESX host called new VM host, so it's not actually going to work. But I want to show you what happens when you do it and when you specify run async. So it says can't contact the specified host. Host may not be available on the network, so on and so forth. So that's pretty straightforward. Let's see what happens if I try it with one of my existing VM hosts, but that's not the right password. But I just want to try it and see what kind of error message we get. Now this is, I mentioned the force parameter, and you can see here we've got a, what I call a fatal error message. And it's telling you, uh-oh, self-signed SSL certificate, and if you trust the host, use the force parameter. So I must use the force. I can do that. Hit enter. Let's see what that does. Okay, I expected that because it wasn't the correct password. Now, one thing that I like to do, I don't even like to type the password on the command line like this. And PowerShell has a neat thing called credential objects, and one commandlet for credential objects called get credential. So what I'm going to do is type $cred equals get credential. And don't forget, PowerShell has great tab completion. So I just typed get-cred tab, and it typed the rest of that for me. So I'm going to hit enter, and you can see I'm prompted for credentials. I'm going to put my real one in here, which I don't want you to know the password for. Now, let's see what I do differently here. Add VM host, name 192.168.1.12. Instead of username and password, I'm going to just say -credential and give it the name of that credential object. And then location, DC, and run async and force. We'll see what that does. And in this case, it shouldn't work because I've got a duplicate. And even so, you do see the error message here. This host is already being managed by this vSphere server. That's basically all I wanted to show you here. If the host weren't a duplicate, then you would be able to see it proceed, and you would see in the vCenter task pane, you would see the a new task, adding a virtual center, or rather a vSphere server. So let's get back to the slides. Okay, now we're going to work with host accounts. This is a screenshot of the Virtual Center client. You can see here where I've actually connected directly to an ESX server. And the reason is that when you're connected to vCenter, the users and groups that you're dealing with are provided by Windows, in the form of either local user accounts or Active Directory user accounts that are accessed through the vCenter server. When you connect directly to an ESX server using the vSphere client, you're dealing with a different set of users and groups, and these are going to be the Unix accounts in the underlying console operating system. And there are commandlets for working with these host accounts, and they're called, as you can see here on the screen, we'll go over them in a minute, but get VM host account, new VM host account, remove, and set. So the first one, get VM host account. This is used to list user accounts from ESX or vCenter. Now, even though you can list them, you can't necessarily modify them with these commandlets. These commandlets definitely only allow you to make changes to those Unix accounts on the console operating system. So you can use the new VM host account commandlet to create a user account. But you do have to be directly connected to the ESX server, and I'll show you what that means in a minute. You can also remove a VM host account, and then you can use set VM host account to modify that user account. Now what you're going to do, you're actually going to use the connect VI server commandlet just as you would to connect to your vCenter server, except that you're going to change those credentials, change that server name to connect to your ESX server directly. There are a small set of commandlets in PowerCLI that work like this. It's unfortunate that you have to make that separate connection, but unfortunately that's a limitation of how the application programming interfaces with ESX work so that you've got to make that separate connection. There are a few important parameters I want to talk about that are common to the VM host commandlets. One of them is called ID, and this is going to be basically the username, the user ID. So, for example, root is an ID. Of course, password, you know what that is. Grant shell access. This is whether or not you would be able to use SSH and shell into the specified user ID. Now, if this is set to true and you're on a 3.x ESX server, then you're good to go. However, if you're running version 4 of vSphere 4 or later, then you're going to have to actually add a VI role to enable that shell access. This is basically just an extra layer of security there. Now, the way that you're going to work with these commandlets, it's easiest to definitely do so using the PowerShell pipeline, and I'll show you examples of this in a minute. What you can do is you can use get VM host account and then have that pull out the information that you need and then pipe the results of that to set or remove the commandlets. Now, you can use get VM host account to read from vCenter, the authentication backend, which is usually going to be Active Directory, but you can't modify these Windows user accounts in any way. Let's get into the specifics here, and I'll show you how to work with these host accounts. Now, you might recall that the title is going to change. You can see that I've got two different ones here. Connected to 168.1.20, that's my vCenter, and then connected to 168.1.12 as root. So using the connect VI server commandlet, I've connected to different locations. Now there's a special variable in PowerCLI called default VI server, and that's holding information about your connection. And you can see this sort of parrots what you see up in the top in the title bar there. So first what we're going to do is we're going to look at the get VM host account commandlet and see what it does when you're connected to vCenter. We'll run it by itself just to see what it does. And you can see here, now that's a dead giveaway. The first one there says administrator. That's pretty obvious and guessed because these are special user accounts that exist on a Windows server. So let's switch over to this window where I'm connected to my ESX server and run the same commandlet. And yep, pretty obvious. We've got root nobody, DCUI user, daemon, vim user, VPX user. These are all Unix accounts. And if you know a little bit about the guts of ESX, you could probably guess that this is an ESXi or a vSphere hypervisor system rather than the big brother. One of the giveaways is that it's got DCUI user, and that is the web interface that you use to maintain an ESXi server. So right away you can see that the commandlet does work against these two different services, but it does behave slightly differently. So let's look and see what else we have to look at here. So let's use get command, and I'm going to say asterisk VM host account. And that's going to provide a quick little list. If you know your way around bash, get command is pretty analogous to the which shell command. So let's work with, let's try here, set VM host account. Check out its parameters. You can see here that we've got two different parameter sets, one called group, one called user. Right away you know that you're going to be able to modify groups and users on an ESX server. So this is set, so that means modify, right? So what we can do is if we've got a user account, then I can change the password. I can change the description. I can assign groups. I can remove it from groups. I can change that shell access permission. And that's pretty much it. So let's try this real quick. I'm going to run this get VM host and see what we see here. Okay. Let's do this. Okay, so you can see that I can give it an ID and a string. So let's do get VM host account ID Hal, which is me. And we'll pipe this to set vmhost account. And let's try and change the description. Okay, hit enter, see what happens. Okay, this is exactly what I wanted to show you. You can see right away, requested operation can only be performed when connected directly to an ESX server. So let's go do that. Try the same example. Get VM host account. This time we'll use I don't know, nobody. Set VM host description. Now that'll take a moment to run through as it makes that change. And one thing interesting, a lot of things you're going to be able to look at the vCenter client or the vSphere client and look at the tasks pane to see what's going on. But since I've connected directly to the ESX server, I don't see that. Now if I opened up a new vSphere client and connected directly to my ESX server, I would see under recent tasks that I had made a modification to that user account. So let's run get VM host account again. And you can see there how it changed from nobody to I am nobody. And also note that after I perform this operation, get VM host and account, and pipe that to set VM host account, what happened? Okay, it actually made that modification and spit out what you could view as just a verification of that. But what it's really done is it spit out that host account object. So if I wanted to in a script, I could assign that to a variable, I could pipe that to another commandlet, so on. There's a lot of stuff you can continue to do in sort of a chain of operations. So that's how you can easily modify a host account. If I wanted to, let's see what we can do to create one. Okay, so it's got some similar parameters to the set VM host account. And let's do that real quick. New VM host account, ID, new user. Actually, make it all lowercase. You know how Unix is. It's all case sensitive like that. Password, foo. Description. This is a new user and grant shell access. I'm going to type a $true. Now, I knew how to do this because if I view the help for the new VM host account, it will tell me that this is a Boolean. And you can see here, Boolean, where it says right there. So PowerShell, whenever you need to supply a true, false, or a Boolean value to a parameter, this is how you do it. The name of the parameter, true, or false, with a $sign there. I'm going to do this. I'm going to say user equals new VM host account, blah, 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 blah. And it didn't work. Now, this is actually, it's great that we're going through this and seeing the error messages so you can see it's told me exactly what's wrong. It didn't like that password foo, which is, it's a good thing, right? So let's modify that password. Foo bar. Bang, bang. Okay, take that. Okay, it liked that one. So notice that I assigned that to variable $u, and there we go. So I could then take u and pipe that to set VM host account, grant false. And I've changed it that quickly. So there you go, some examples of working with VM host accounts. Host services. Okay, if I go to the host configuration page and then to security profile, you'll see in this instance I've got 2 services running. This is an ESXi system. On an ESX system, you will have a greater number of services. Now, this screen, you can select whether you want the service to start automatically, start and stop with the host, and so on. And you've got controls to manipulate the service. That is what we're going to be working with in PowerCLI. So we have a set of commandlets called the VM host service commandlets. That is the string that they all have in common. First one is get VM host service. It's going to retrieve that list. Restart is going to restart a host service. Set is going to modify one. And of course, we've got start and stop to manually perform that action. These commandlets, unlike the VM host account commandlets, these do not require a direct connection to an ESX server, so it makes them a little easier to work with. Important parameters would be VM host, host service, and policy. So the VM host is simply going to be either the name or the PowerShell object representing one or more of your ESX hosts. So since you don't require that direct connection to ESX server, it means you can very easily manipulate the host services on multiple ESX servers with one command. So let's see, the next one here is host service, and I'll explain what this means during our examples, but this is an object representing the service that you want to work with, for example, VPXA. And then policy. Policy parameter determines when a service is started. It's got 3 values that are accepted here: automatic, on, and off. Automatic, obviously, is going to start and stop with your host server. Okay, so let's get right into it. Okay, I've got a window up here. Let's start with git command VM host service. Okay, there are the ones which I had mentioned. Let's do help on one of them. We can do also dash question mark. We'll get that first page of the help file. So let's try this. I'm going to run it by itself and see what happens. So value cannot be found for the mandatory parameter VM host. So that means that we need to get VM hosts first. Okay, I'm going to perform this operation on both of my host servers. You'll note that I put my second host server into maintenance. Let's just take this and pipe it to get VM host service. Hit enter. Okay, now I've got a quick table containing in this case, the 2 values for each ESXi server. Let's see, we're doing this a lot. Let's just say s equals. So now I've got a variable which I can work with interactively as I'm performing these examples here. So don't forget, in PowerShell you can use square brackets and then numbers to index into a collection. And they start with 0. So S0 is going to be the first service in this case. S1 is going to be the second service, and so on. And one of my favorite commandlets in PowerShell is the group object commandlet. Okay, so what this does, I've just grouped things by one of the properties. You can also group by policy or by running. So that's kind of handy. Just different ways to parse the same sort of information. Now let's try to work with one of these. Let's do this. Let's say group by key, and I'm going to assign that to a variable. We'll call that G. So G0, hope you're following me here, is going to be a group only containing the NTPD services. There's another way to do this just using the get VM host service commandlet. So I'm just going to hit up and down here up in my history, just showing you various ways to work with these services. Now the get VM host service commandlet does have some parameters. Now note that it doesn't have a parameter for the service name. So we're not going to be able to filter using this commandlet. Say that I just want to work with the NTPD service. So there's a couple different ways to handle this. One is to use the group object commandlet, and another is to use the where object commandlet. So let's go back to, I think I've got it in S. I do. Okay, so let's say S, pipe that to where object, and I want to say $_key, and I'll explain what this means in a second. Okay, so what we have is we're going to take this PowerShell collection of VM host service objects, pipe that through where object, and it's going to do whatever is in the curly braces once for every item coming through. So in this case, it's going to run it 4 times, and $_ is going to be replaced with that current object in the pipeline. What I'm doing here is I'm saying $_.key. It's going to grab the contents of the key property, which, as you can see, is going to contain the name of that service. And I'm saying if the key is -eq, if it's equal to NTPD in quotes, in single quotes or double quotes, you could use them interchangeably in this case. If this evaluates to true, this part in between the curly braces, then pass this information down the pipeline. I'm going to hit enter, show you what it does, and it returns only the NTPD services. So if you're with me so far, what am I about to do? Restart VM host service. So if you wanted to, if for any reason that you would want to restart a service or stop or start or edit, which I'll show you in a minute, this is a great way to do it. And you could do this very quickly among all of your ESX servers in your enterprise or in your cluster or whatever criteria that you wanted to use. So since this is something that could have a potential impact to your services, luckily VMware flagged it as such, and PowerShell has a built-in feature to look for a commandlet which has an activity that is flagged as being dangerous, and it's called confirm preference. And basically it's asking you if you want to continue. So that's a neat little feature. I can just hit enter, and it'll go ahead and do it for the first one. Note that I'm still prompted for the second one. And if I had 50 host services I wanted to restart, obviously I know what I'm doing. Well, maybe it's not obvious. I know what I'm doing, and I'm just going to say A, and it will do it to all of them. Now, let's see if that shows up in the vSphere client. Yes, you can see here, we've got one entry for each of my host services where that restart command was performed. So we're going to edit one of these. So let's go back to S. Let's see, S0 going to be the NTP daemon on the first of my 2 servers. Actually, before I do anything with it, I'm going to pipe it to format list, abbreviated here as FL. Note that we've got some more information. So in the table, we have key label policy running and required. But when I pipe it to list, I've got those plus a few other things. I have, let's see, unique, I've got rule set. I have uninstallable, VM host ID, VM host, and some other more arcane types of things. Extension data is actually a pretty cool property. And extension data is, if you've worked with the get view commandlet with PowerCLI, extension data is sort of a shortcut to get access to that server-side view of things. It's more of an advanced capability, and it's a great feature to have that sort of readily available like this. Anyway, I just wanted to show you that there's some more information behind the scenes there. So let's say that I want to edit this one service. First, let's look at the set VM host service commandlet. And you can see basically I've only got one thing that I can do with this commandlet. I supply to it the name of a host service, and then I'm able to edit the policy. So let's do this. Instead of doing it over the pipeline, I'll show you the alternate form, which is just a set VM host service -host service. Now remember, because this pipeline column is set to true, I can pass that over the pipeline, but in this case I'm not going to do that. S0, and let's say policy equals blah. Now PowerShell and PowerCLI is telling me what I can do. The possible enumeration values are automatic, on, and off. So if I want to change the policy of this one service such that it doesn't start with the system, and in fact that it doesn't start at all, I can set it to off. And if you were to go into the vSphere client, you can see update service activation policy. And let's see if I'm on the same host. I believe I am. Let's see, this is The NTP daemon is the one that I was working with. Options, start and stop manually. So previously it was set to start automatically. Let's escape out of here, change it back, show you how easy it is to do that. And you can see here the policy went from off to automatic. Look in the vCenter client. That new update command happened. And let's go to it, look at it, and you can see it is now set to start automatically. So, depending on what you're doing, if you're doing onesie-twosie changes here and there to individual hosts, it may or may not be worth the time to do it in PowerShell. It kind of just depends on what you're doing. There's a threshold where, obviously, at some point, it is much more efficient to do something in PowerCLI if you're going to be operating on more than one object. So if you want to change the startup policy on multiple services across multiple host servers, then it's going to be much more efficient to do it, to script it, than to do it in the vSphere client. So that completes my demo for host services. Okay, now we're going to work with the Network Time Protocol, otherwise known as NTP. So you can see here's a screenshot of the vSphere client. I've gone into configuration on a host, and then to the time configuration screen. If you click on the properties button, you can edit things such as the NTP server IP address. There's a few different ways of doing this. You can specify an NTP server during the setup portion when you're installing ESX, and then you edit it after the fact in this screen that I'm showing you here. Alternately, you can also put that setting within a host profile if you use those, and the host profile can enforce an NTP server setting as well. I'm going to show you how to do it in PowerShell. We've got 3 different commandlets that are used with working with these. They all have the string vmhost NTP server in them. First one is add, and this is to add an NTP server configuration. When I say NTP server configuration, it's the long form. All we're doing is adding a single IP address. Get is going to display the NTP servers configured for 1 or more host servers. And then remove is going to remove that server configuration or that IP address. These commandlets do not require direct connection to the ESX server. And we only have a couple parameters to worry about: the host name that you're going to be working with and the NTP server. So let's get straight into the demo. Let's start with get command. I always like to throw new aliases at you guys. GCM is the alias for get command, the built-in alias. So let's do a get command, and we'll say *NTP. See what that does. Okay, so there's a few. Let's just say *NTP server. That should do it. Okay, so here are the 3 that we're concerned with. First, we're going to do view the help on get vmhost NTP server. Hit enter. It's pretty straightforward. This is a very simple commandlet. So let's run it by itself. And mandatory parameter vmhost. So I knew that was coming, obviously. Get vmhost, pipe that to get vmhost NTP server. I'm just hitting tab a few times to save myself some typing. And there we go. So I only got back 1. You guys know I've got 2 host servers in my environment. So let's do this a different way. Get vmhost. Okay, that's my first one. Pipe that to get vmhost NTP server. Okay, so let's change this to my second host server and see what happens. I get back nothing. Let's add one. Instead of typing this over again, okay, now I've got a PowerShell variable called h, which has my second host server. Now we're going to do is add. Let's look at our list. Add vmhost NTP server. Okay, let's look at its parameters. Now, note that we've got NTP server, and then it says in the second column here for type, string with a couple of square brackets. Anytime you see two empty square brackets next to each other in PowerShell, the implication is that you can pass a collection of items to that. So what this means is I can give this NTP server parameter multiple strings, and it will just take it. It will take it and run with it. Same goes here for VM hosts. I can specify multiple VM hosts to this command line. And the way that you do this in PowerShell, typically, it's going to be comma-separated values. So I'll show you two different ways you can do this. Let's say NTP servers equal 192.168.1.1, comma 192.168.1. I'm making these up, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, so now I've got two comma-separated values. Now they are strings. These aren't numbers. Because I've got a decimal in there and it's an IP address format. So PowerShell is going to look at these as strings. So since it's a string, I have to put the single or double quotes around them. So I've done that here. So if I hit enter, NTP servers is a variable containing two strings, and there you go. So I've got two variables I'm working with now. So let's just do add VM host NTP server VM host H, because you remember I assigned that up here. And then I'm going to say dash NTP server, and we'll just say NTP servers. And let's see what happens when I hit enter. Okay, so it returned back that list, kind of showing me in a verbose manner, this is what I just did. Let's scroll up here in my history and say that I want to grab a list of the VM host NTP servers from my second host server. Sure enough, I get two. Let's go see what it did in the vSphere client. You can see it's calling this one update configuration. Let's go to that host. It's the one that's in maintenance. And let's go to time configuration, and there you go. You see that we've got the two entries right there. Now what happens if you change something in the vSphere client? I'm going to remove this one. Yes, I'm sure. And oh sure, why not? Let's restart the NTP service to changes. You can see that it is doing this, and I just want to show you sort of the round trip capability here. Let's minimize this, get back. Now let's run this command again, and sure enough, the changes that I make in one system are visible in the other system. So that's basically all there is to it, to VM host NTP server. SNMP, or Simple Network Management Protocol, which of course is the silliest thing I've ever heard, because the Simple Network Management Protocol is anything but simple. I'm not going to go into a background of SNMP, but suffices to say that it's used often for managing network devices, are the most common. You do see it for appliances, maybe UPS devices, and sometimes it's appropriate to do the same thing with your ESX host server. There's a lot to be said for it. There's other ways of managing and monitoring services, but if you use SNMP in your environment today, well, you're probably going to want to do that consistently across everything, and you might want to enable SNMP on your ESX host servers as well. You can do it using some PowerShell-like commandlets. There are a few of them. There's get vmhost SNMP. That will retrieve your settings. Set vmhost SNMP has a few different modes here. You can use it to either enable or disable SNMP. You can configure your read-only community strings. You can add an SNMP trap target or remove an SNMP trap target. So the trap targets, these are talking about where something happens on your ESX server, and when it notices that this thing happens, it will then send a trap. It will send an outbound notification to an SNMP management station. So the read-only community string, this is sort of the inverse. This is polling. So this is when you have an SNMP management station hitting an IP address every so often and then checking certain values to see that they are what they should be. You can enable that, both use cases, sending traps and polling with ESX using these commandlets. And then you've got test vmhost SNMP, and this will send a test SNMP trap to a management station. Some notes about them. There's no GUI equivalent, at least not one that I could easily find that's exposed. Maybe it's buried in there and I just haven't found it yet. You usually are going to configure these via either a direct SSH connection, or you can use the vCLI, which is the Perl-based, or you can use PowerCLI. You do have to do this directly connected to an ESX server using Connect VI Server to modify the SNMP settings. Now, I may have sort of indicated in the past that this means that you can't do an operation against multiple host servers at the same time, and that's actually incorrect. You can do it, it just takes a little bit more work. It's always great to be able to take advantage of the vCenter and its already connected ability, because it's already connected to all of your host servers. It's nice to take advantage of that. It makes things simpler. But in some cases, you can't do that. Let's see. Now let's go right into configuring SNMP. Now let's do some examples where we have to connect directly to an ESX server, but we want to do something against multiples of them. So we can do that. First, I'm going to disconnect from my active connection. So let's say cred equals get credential. This is going to be the root user credentials on both of my ESX servers. And let's do connect. And I'm going to do two of them separated by commas, credential, $sign, cred. Now, I know this is actually not going to work. I have to put quotes around that. Let's see what happens. And you can see that it did acknowledge the connection. So let's see what happens, for example, if I type in get VM. You might have noticed there was a slight delay as it populated this list. So it is getting this from both servers. So get VM host. This works similarly to when you're connecting to a vCenter server. However, if you look, it says here at the top in my title bar, connected to 2 servers, and there are the IP addresses which I'm using. Back to where we were going. Let's do get VM host SNMP. In a previous video, I showed you a special variable, default VI server. Notice it only has one listing there. There's another one called default VI servers with an S, and that is where it's tracking the state of what I'm connecting to. I am directly connected to my ESX servers, so that means that there are certain things I can do in this mode right now, and there's certain things I can't do. So I'm not sure if this is going to work. I've not tried this before. Yeah, okay. Templates don't exist in ESX server. They exist in the database of vCenter. So that's why get template didn't work, even though I really do. In fact, I can show you just very quickly. Get template, and you can see I've got a template that is visible in my vCenter server. Anyway, back to SNMP. Let's minimize this. That is just going to bug me. There we go. Okay, so let's see. We have get command SNMP. Let's see what all I have in my system. That's most of them. Now, I'll show you another trick with with get command. The command type parameter. So now I have filtered the list down to seeing it's only going to show command lines as opposed to applications or scripts or whatever the case may be. So here they are. So let's do get VM host SNMP --, retrieves the host SNMP configuration. And to specify a server different from the default, we'll use the server parameter. Most, if not all, of the PowerCLI commandlets have a server parameter. I haven't mentioned them before because I tend to not use the server parameter that much. But this is a case where you might need to do so. So let's see here where I've got get VM host SNMP. Okay, in this case, they're enabled. Let's see what happens if I want to modify the state. So we've got, let's see if I scroll up. We have get, set, and test. So let's look at the parameters for set. There's actually, it's a pretty complex set of parameters here. We have 1, 2, 3, and 4 modes for this commandlet. The first one, called default, basically it's just used to enable SNMP, disable SNMP. You can change a port, and you can set the read-only community. Then you have the ability to remove a trap target, add a trap target, and there's a different way to remove a trap target. You can see here that we've got a bunch of different parameters to work with. I'm just going to focus on right now enabling or disabling SNMP and setting that read-only community. Start here. Okay, so since the enabled parameter is a Boolean type, that's how I know that I need to specify $false. Hit enter, and it's spitting back false. I do have a second vSphere client window open that's connected directly to one of my host servers, and you can see here that we just have an event that popped up, reconfigure SNMP agent. So it's real easy to enable and disable. However, there is a slight caveat here. Notice the error message. General system error occurred. Set one community string or trap target for agent to listen on first. This is one of the more confusing error messages. If you're starting from scratch, you're starting from zero with SNMP not enabled, and you just want to enable it, this is logically how I would expect for that to be done. But for whatever reason, you have to do it slightly differently. So I'm going to take off enabled, and I'm going to say read-only community, and just give a value of public, for example. Okay, so notice that it set the flag of enabled to true, and now I've got something in here for my read-only communities. So this is cool. It works. It's relatively straightforward once you understand the little bit of extra syntax that you've got to worry about in this case here. Let's go ahead and do one more example. I'm just going to run get vmhost snmp, and I'm going to assign that to a variable. Now, $SN contains those two. Now, let's figure out how to add a trap target. Here's my parameter set dealing with that. So some of these are sort of duplicates from the others. Let's see, target community, target port, target host, and add target. And you can see here that several of these are flagged as mandatory. Add target is mandatory, target host is mandatory, target community is mandatory, as is host SNMP. So let's work with this. Set vmhost snmp host snmp. This is referring to basically the input here, or what we're going to be setting, what we're going to be modifying. I'm going to say add target true, and that's going to put it in the right mode that it needs to be in. Target community, and let's say the target community is ESX, just for example. And target host, we're wrapping on the next line here. Okay, so target host is, and we'll just say management station dot. And there we go. Now, it's not immediately obvious that this change was made because I only see information that it's enabled, the port, and the read-only communities. So let's see how we could figure out that it actually did it. So let's go back. We're going to refresh this SN variable so it'll obtain the latest information. And I'm going to pipe this to format list, which is aliased to FL. There's 1, there's 2, and you can see trap targets very clearly here. And management station :0-ESX. It's kind of a funny looking format for it, but it looks like we've got the host name of our management station, and make an assumption here that 0 indicates that it's using the default port for SNMP traffic, and then the dash, and then ESX is going to be the destination trap community name. So that's basically all there is to it, and this is it is one of the more complex sets of commandlets to work with, the set vmhost snmp commandlet, but it gets the job done. And as you noticed, you can definitely do this against multiple servers at the same time. You just have to take care to use that connect VI server commandlet in a different way than you might be using when you're working with your vCenter server. In this next section, I'm going to talk to you about maintaining your ESX host. In this screenshot here, you can see that I've clicked on an ESX host, right-clicked on it actually, and you can see a menu here. We have some options such as enter maintenance mode, shutdown, restart. Some of the things that you're going to need to do on an ongoing basis to your ESX hosts. Of course, there is a Power CLI commandlet for that, and one of the main ones that we'll be talking about right now is called set VM host. So the set VM host commandlet is used to enter or exit maintenance mode. It does a few other things as well. For example, you can optionally evacuate powered on virtual machines such that your cluster state is still up. You can also change your swap file policy. So this would be if you have, if you want to, you could store the swap files for your virtual machines on less expensive local disks as opposed to your network storage. So that's a policy that you can set on a per virtual machine host or ESX server level. You can also modify which data store that those swap files are going to be placed into. You can attach or detach a host profile. Here are some of the more important parameters for this commandlet. Of course, you have the VM host parameter. That's how you specify which host server you're going to be working with. You have the state parameter. You can set this one to connected or maintenance, and I'll show you how this works in just a moment. We have VM swap file policy. The options for that one are in-host, data store, or with VM. And then profile, that is used to specify a host profile if you wanted to attach one to your ESX server. For our demonstration, I'm going to show you how to place an ESX server into maintenance. Let me just quickly bring up the shell here. Now I am logged in. Let's get a list of my virtual machine hosts. You can see I've got the standard 2 there that I've been working with. Let's just take one of them and examine the output. Pipe that to format list, alias to FL here. So in the results here, let's see, right at the top, state and connection state and power state. These first two are actually the same thing, somewhat obvious here. And then power state, powered on. So the connection state can vary. This will correspond to, if I show you in the vSphere client, that will correspond to right here under hosts. State is, you can see, connected right here. If you were to power off a virtual machine host or reboot it, or if there's a network issue, you're going to see a disconnected state there, and if it's maintenance, you'll see a maintenance state, and so forth. So let me show you what you can do with set VM host, some of the options on it. So we talked about state already, VM swap file policy, VM swap file data store, profile, evacuate I mentioned. If this is a Boolean, so it can be a true or false value. When your ESX host is a part of a cluster and it has virtual machines on it, you're going to obviously want to make sure that those virtual machines stay up during any maintenance operation. So you're going to want to set this to true, and that is the same thing. In fact, I'll show you on the vSphere client. Right click on this guy, go to enter maintenance mode. This checkbox right here, move powered off and suspended virtual machines to other hosts in the cluster, that is the evacuate setting. So if the box is checked, that is equivalent to saying evacuate is true, and if the box is unchecked, that's equivalent to evacuate is false. Let's see, time zone, so you can change the time zone on your server. Let's go ahead and set this guy to maintenance. So I'm going to hit up arrow a couple times and pipe this to set VM host. And the way that you make this settings change is using the state parameter. And what I like to do is just type anything and hit enter, and PowerShell will tell you the acceptable values. We have connected, disconnected, not responding, and maintenance. Now you can't actually set a VM host to either disconnected or not responding. Those are simply values that an ESX server can end up in. If you were to unplug the network cable, then it'll say not responding. And if you were to reboot it, it'll say disconnected for a period of time. But what we're going to be working here with is maintenance. So real easy to do. Maintenance, if you can spell it correctly. Hit enter. And that's basically all there is to it. And if you go to the vSphere client, you'll see enter maintenance mode has started. In fact, that's done now. So if I had virtual machines powered on, then this would actually stay here until I had taken care of vMotioning the virtual machines or powering them off. I would have had to have done that manually. However, if I specified up here, we see the evacuate parameter. If I had set evacuate to true, then the maintenance operation would continue automatically, and vCenter would take care of vMotioning those virtual machines off to other hosts in the cluster automatically. So that's it for the demo of entering maintenance mode with PowerCLI. Now we're going to be talking about host profiles. If you've worked with host profiles before, it's a pretty cool feature. The concept is you want to take configuration settings which you have applied to one of your host servers, and you want to bundle them up and repeatedly apply them to multiple servers. Usually you're going to bind them to a cluster, and that way you'll know that everything in that cluster is configured identically to the other systems. There are several commandlets. The VM host profile is the name of the noun that's used on these commandlets. Okay, the first one we're going to mention here is get VM host profile. This is how you retrieve the available host profiles. New VM host profile. This is to create a new host profile based on a reference host. Remove is to get rid of a host profile. Set is how you can modify a specified host profile. Got a few more here. Apply VM host profile. That's how you're going to actually make changes and affect them on a host server. You have to have the server in maintenance mode before you can apply one of these, just the same as if you're doing it from within vCenter, the vSphere client. Export VM host profile. That'll let you export the profile to a file, and basically it's going to save all those settings as an XML file. Then you can use import to bring it back in. And lastly, test VM host profile compliance. And this is going to let you see whether or not your systems are compliant with a given host profile. Okay, let's go to the shell and we will see if we can't work our way through several demonstrations of these commandlets. Okay, let me see what I see. And this is what you saw in the screenshot a minute ago. Apply, export, get, import, new, move, set, and test. So let's start off with get. Run it by itself, and you'll see that I've got 2 in my system. Let's real quick glance at our vSphere client and see where this comes from. At home, and then go to host profiles. Okay, you can see there we have the 2 of them there, gold profile and host profile. Okay, first let's see if there's any extra settings on this. Okay, we do have several. You can use name, description to filter what comes out of the system when you use the get VM host profile. Entity, if you wanted to say, show me only the VM host profiles which are attached to my cluster A, well then you can do that. And then reference host, if you want to see what are the host profiles which were based on a certain reference host. So I can show you how that works. Okay, and if I change this to my second host, you should see 0. Okay, correct. So another example of getting, and let's say that I want to get all of them that start with the string gold, and you can see there that it just returned the 1. So get is pretty basic. Let's look at some of those other commandlets. Just scroll up and look here. New VM host profile, let's see how to do that. Okay, so basically all there is to it is you specify a reference host and then a name and a description. Description is optional. So let's do that. Reference host is going to be we'll use my second one for the heck of it. And name, and then description. And these don't take that long to create. There we go, that's done. If we look in vCenter, you see create host profile right there, and of course it shows up right here. So that's pretty straightforward. If I click on export here, you can see that I'm given the option to save this as a VPF. Let's see what that looks like. Let's do a get VM host profile test asterisk and pipe that to export. And it's asking me for a file path. So I'm going to say, not sure if this will work. Let's try it. Okay, let's cd to my temp, and let's do this. Let's look at the parameters on this export VM host profile. File path is the one that you saw that I was prompted for a moment ago. Profile, force, and server. So let's do this again. Similarly, file path is going to be test.vpf. And there we go. And import is going to work inversely. I'm not going to show you that. Let's look at some of the other ones. We looked at get, we looked at new and export. So let's look at set. First, let's get a host profile and set it as a variable. So if I type $HP, there we go. So let's look at set. So we can rename a VM host profile, and we can also change the reference host, and we can change the description. So let's see if I can just change the name real quick. And oh, I know that, by the way, since this says pipeline true, I can pass a host profile on the pipeline and specify it that way. There we go. I'm just setting it to a new name and hit enter, and it will spit it out. And then if we look in vCenter, sure enough, it's now called new name. Pretty straightforward. Last and not least, I think one of the most important things you're going to do to these is apply a VM host profile. So first, let's try to apply it. Entity is what you're going to be applying it to, and profile is the object in question that you're working with. Let's look at the help for this. I'm going to type -full so that I get the full description of everything. Scroll down a little bit. Variable. Specify a hash table object that provides values for the host profile required variables. So you can imagine, say that you're applying a host profile to an entire cluster, and one of the values in that cluster is the IP address for your, maybe the VM kernel interface on which you'll be running your vMotions. So if you try to apply this host profile using vCenter, what it's going to do is it's going to prompt you for values as it goes, the required values. In this case, you would have to supply IP addresses. So the way that you would do that programmatically using PowerCLI is with this variable parameter. Now, if you use the associate only parameter, that's how you just make that tie. So let me show you what I mean. Note that under this new test host profile that we made, hosting clusters, it's blank. However, when I go to my one of my older ones, this one here, host profile, hosting clusters is, you can see that I've got my cluster and my hosts attached to it. So let's try that. First, we're going to use our HP that we just did, pipe that to set VM host profile. And before I do that, actually, let's remind ourselves what we're working with. Okay, instead of working with the host, let's apply it to a cluster. Got one called ent cluster. Let's call it CL. So now I've assigned that to a variable. So we're going to do HP, pipe that to set VM host entity. Oh wait, we were actually working with apply, weren't we? You almost got me. There we go, entity. So I'm going to say cluster right here, and then I'm going to say associate only, and let's see if that does it. Say it's going to ask me if I'm sure. Let's hit enter, and that was pretty quick. You can see that it returned the cluster object here. Let's see what happened in vCenter client. And there we go. So you can see host profile was the one, it used to be assigned to this one. Now it is assigned to my new cluster. You can see here the task, attach host profile. So that's what associate only does. It performs that attach. Let's go back to our list of commandlets. And we can do test host profile compliance. Let's do HP, pipe that to test. Okay. And this has got some interesting information, which it's hard for me to read in this format. So let's do it this way. Let's say results equals. While that's doing that, I'm going to look and see what happened in my vSphere client. Check compliance. Happened twice. And refresh the screen, you can see that it says I've got one non-compliant cluster and one non-compliant host. And of course, this is my reference host, so that one is going to show up as compliant. Let's look at this results. Pipe that to format list. Okay, now I can read this with a little more detail. It's still rather hard to work with, so let me examine this in compliance element list property. Now I just typed in IN and then hit tab, and that way I didn't have to type that big thing. Okay, now this is starting to look useful. Actually, let's do one more thing. I'll pipe that to format list as well. Okay, now I can read everything, so that's great. Property name, network, host, port group, and then we've got the ID for a certain port group, NIC type. Given services are not enabled on the port group, VM kernel. And the same thing here, given services are not enabled on the port group, VM kernel 2. So basically this is telling me that there are some networking differences. And if I were to use the apply VM host profile commandlet, then these are the settings that it would change. So you can see how it would be a really neat way to be able to kind of see if you've got any sort of configuration drift in your clusters, and you could make a report showing which ones, what's changed. So that's how you work with VM host profiles using PowerCLI. Okay, that's it for this lesson. Let's talk a little bit about what we covered. First, I gave you an overview of the VM host commandlets, and then we talked about the most important one, which is the get VM host commandlet. Then I showed you how to add an ESX server to vCenter. Obviously, this is something you'll be doing a lot when you're first setting up a new cluster. Then we talked about managing host accounts. Don't forget, you do have to connect directly to an ESX server using the connect VI server commandlet to do that. Then we worked with host services and configured network time protocol. Then we worked with the SNMP stack, configured that. Then I showed you how using setvm host to put an ESX host into maintenance mode. And then we worked with host profiles